We have a verse that is at the very, very end of the Megillah. It's literally the last verse of the Megillah. And because it's towards the end, it's very often, not disregarded, but let's say overlooked or something along those lines. And this entire Sikha is about what it really means. So simply speaking, it aids in concentration when you're looking at the words. You're obviously not going to make mistakes if you're going from what's written as opposed to what your memory is. But on a deeper level, Kabbalistically speaking, it's explained that each letter, and certainly each word, portal of the life force of that tefillah. And if you're looking at the letters, very similar to how when we raise the Torah, we're supposed to look at the letters. So that opens that portal as opposed to if you are just saying the words. Even if you say them 100% correctly and accurately from your memory, you lose that aspect of the davening. Rebbe, that he would have his siddur with him and open his siddur for even, basic like after bracha, after eating or something, or benching, something that everybody can easily learn by heart. And certainly he knew by heart, but nevertheless, he would open his siddur and say it from the siddur. Here says, the very last verse of the whole of the Megillah, Ki Mordechai ha-Yehudi, because Mordechai the Jew, v'rotzi l'reiv echov, was the second to the king, etc., and he was pleasant or a benefit, depends on how you render it, to the majority of his brothers. That's the translation. The Omer Razal in the Gemara says, the sages say in the Gemara, L'roiv echov, it says the majority of his brothers, v'loi l'chol echov, but it doesn't say to all of his brothers. Milamed, from here it teaches you, shepirshu memenu mixes Sanhedrin, that some of, a minority of the Sanhedrin, that's his brothers, not the whole of the Jewish people, but his brothers in that regard, divested from him. They weren't on board with him anymore. Shehein hein echov, the Sanhedrin are what are considered his brothers. Chaveirov b'Sanhedrin, his friends or his colleagues in the Sanhedrin. So again, the Sanhedrin 71 people. He was the 71st, the number one guy, and then there's 70. A minority divested from him, didn't like him anymore. Why? Ubepirish Rashi, and Rashi explains, Lefi shebotel medivrei Torah v'nichnas l'srara. Because once he got the house of Haman, which means now he became on the position of Haman, an advisor to the king, he was no longer involved in learning Torah, literally because he nullified from learning Torah, and entered rulership. That's what Rashi says. Okay? V'tzarech bir, and we need explanation. Ha'echet tochen, how is it possible Mordechai Atzadik, that Mordechai the righteous, Yishayir b'Sanhedrin, would remain in the Sanhedrin, gam la'acharei shenichnas l'srara v'hayabatel midivrei Torah, even after entering a position of rulership and supposedly being nullified from words of Torah. V'haloi kol inyan Sanhedrin hu eisek Torah, isn't the whole idea of the Sanhedrin is involvement in Torah, whether in teaching or in adjudicating Torah? So if he's righteous, and of course he is, and he's no longer fit for the position, apparently, he shouldn't stay. And if he stays, somehow he is fit for the position. L'heiris l'Yisrael hilchas Torah. The whole idea of the Sanhedrin, again, is to teach the Jewish people the laws of the Torah, whether by adjudication or just by teaching. Zeis v'eid, and furthermore, Shirak miksa Sanhedrin pishu mimenu, only a minority of the Sanhedrin divested from him, ukimifurish bikra, like it says in the actual verse, degam la'acharei shenichnas l'srara, that even after he entered the position of rulership of in the government and whatever, nishar ratzei l'roiv echov, he remained a benefit or pleasant to the majority of his brothers, Sheim Chaveirav b'Sanhedrin. That this is a reference, his brothers is a reference to his colleagues in the Sanhedrin. Hare sheroi b'Sanhedrin, that means that the majority of the Sanhedrin, people that also know Torah a little bit, and probably know what the Sanhedrin is all about, Saver Lohem, were of the position, Ki Mordechai dekach ya'asa l'ishar b'Sanhedrin, that for Mordechai it was appropriate that he should remain in the Sanhedrin, gam la'acharei knisas l'srara, even after his entry into the government position, rulership. So everything over here doesn't seem to make sense. he himself should be righteous enough to do what's right. And if, for whatever reason, he's no longer studying Torah or teaching Torah or not involved in Torah and now has become an advisor, chief advisor, srada, rulership, then he shouldn't be in the Sanhedrin, he should leave. But he didn't leave. And if it's really not appropriate that he should stay, and for whatever reason he has succumbed to temptation of power or who knows what, how come the majority of the Sanhedrin are still with him? V'yeshleimar, and the answer is, the tole beplugsas abavli v'Yerushalmi. This all depends on the two positions as stated in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. Gabe chasidim harishenim shoyushayin tes shoyes bayem betfila. Regarding the first pious ones that used to prepare for davening by an hour, daven for an hour, and then debrief, as it were, for another hour. That's 3 hours per tefillah, per davening, and that's 3 davenings a day, 9 hours a day. That's a Mishnah. Now, the Gemara, both of those Gemaras, Bavli and Yerushalmi, ask a question on that Mishnah. Umakshe beGemara. The question in the Gemara is, Teirasan Masai Nasis. When did they do Torah? 9 hours a day, right? You have to sleep a little bit. You have to eat, let's say, just a little bit. Never mind, let's say you don't have to make a living somehow. 9 hours out of the day you're davening, that's a lot. What about Torah? What about learning Torah? When was that done? Umashni, and it's answered, it's taught, Miteich shechasidim eim, because they are chasidim, because they are doing so out of piety, genuine piety, Teirasa mishtameres. Their Torah is guarded, is preserved. They don't forget the Torah that they learned just because they are, in essence, divesting from it for so many hours. That's what the Bavli says. Ulam b'Yerushalmi, but in the Yerushalmi, the answer is completely different. Sham, over there, Hagirsa, the wording is, Al Yedei Shahayu Chasidim, because they were Chasidim, Hoysa bracha nitenes beteirasan. There was a bracha given in their Torah. Same concept, right? Because in Chasidim, they don't have to worry about Torah. But that's only in very general terms. There's a massive distinction between the two. According to their Bavli, their Torah was preserved, meaning they didn't go backwards in Torah, but they also didn't go upwards as much because they weren't learning. The Yerushalmi says something even more powerful. Not only did they not go backwards, that the Torah was preserved, there was a bracha given to them in their Torah, that despite not investing the time and energy in Torah learning, they actually elevated, ascended in Torah learning. Because they were doing so out of piety's sake. Hari lefonenu pluksa, behold, before us is a discussion, a disagreement. Lefia Bavli, as far as the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud is concerned, Teirasei rak mishtameres. The person's Torah is only preserved. The Talmudam shalom doad ata, that they're learning, that they learned until now, loy mishtakach mehem, does not get forgotten by them. But that doesn't mean that they're increasing, that only means that they're not decreasing. Avol bat, Mikol Mokem la yisvasev etzlam rakefi zmanam apone shenisha lohem latam Torah. But nevertheless, it doesn't aggregate by them their learning Torah any more than the time that they put in. So they don't lose. They put in very little time according to just the schedule of the day, 9 hours out of the day, right? You have very little time for learning Torah. According to the Bavli, that little amount of time should, if it weren't for the piety that's involved in those 9 hours, should cause you to forget some of your learning. But because they're pious, and because they're doing this 9 hours of davening for piety's sake, there is a preservation that happens with their Torah. They do not forget it. But if because of those 9 hours, they can now put in only an hour or something into further Torah study, they're only gaining by an hour's worth more Torah. It's just not to go into the red. That's it, according to the Bavli. By the way, it's explained that this is the position of the Bavli because it's from Golos, right? Bavel is the Golos, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael. Mashienken, whereas on the other hand, Yerushalmi, as far as the Yerushalmi position is, Nitna lachasidim bracha miyuchedes bilimudam. there was a special bracha that they received in their learning, again, because of the piety of those 9 hours, that not only is it that they didn't forget any of their learning, that already is kind of goes without saying, that there was a special bracha that because now, let's say again, they could only invest an hour into learning, that hour would produce as if they were learning much more than the hour because of this bracha, because of those 9 hours being for piety's sake. Masha'enkin la Yerushalmi. Whereas on the other hand, by the Yerushalmi, nitna lachasidim bracha miyuchedes belimudam, a special bracha was given to the Chasidim because of their for their study. Sheitzlichu lohavinu lahaskil miyad v'lo yushoyim, that they immediately would understand whatever it was that they were learning, and they didn't have to delay. So whereas a normal person, it would take him an hour, he had an hour to learn, but in that hour, he wouldn't get the things right away. He'd have to reread it, think about it, ask questions, whatever. They didn't have any of those problems, and so in an hour, they were able to cover more. V'im kein, and so, if so, it's not only that they didn't forget that which they learned until now, that's already the Bavli's position, but rather they got concepts and understood things in Torah as if they were those that all day were learning Torah, though they were doing nothing of the sort. They were 9 hours davening. V'hinei Itmer mishmei de hagoyin ba'al sofnas pa'aneach miroget shav. It said in the name of the Roget Shav Goyin, who was a genius in Torah learning about 100 years ago, the plug sazu, that this discussion, this disagreement, he gam legabe talmid chocham ha'oisik b'tzarchei tzibur, applies to this day and age, to our day and age. For a talmid chocham, somebody who could and should be learning all day, who isn't learning all day, but is rather involved in needs of the congregation. The Lishitas Bavli, that as far as the Bavli is concerned, just like the Hasidim who would, for piety's sake, invest 9 hours into davening, and that would cause their Torah not to be forgotten. Teiros Seirak Nishtameres, a Talmid Chacham who now isn't learning, but for piety's sake, for the sake of the congregation, is doing their needs. His Torah isn't forgotten. However much he can invest from his day, that's how much extra he'll learn. But at least it won't be forgotten, the fact that he's not learning Torah all that much. Uleshita Yerushalmi, and when it comes to the Yerushalmi, bracha nitenes b'teirasei. Just like back then, the Hasidim, who would invest 9 hours of into davening for piety's sake, not only wouldn't forget their Torah, but they would have extra success because of a blessing in their learning of Torah. So too the Talmid Chacham nowadays, who isn't learning as much as he should because he's involved in communal affairs, he also has that bracha and will understand a lot more Torah in the amount of time that he does have to invest in it. And based on this, it's proper to conclude, and this is a disagreement of Mordechai, and with him, who were the majority of his fellows, of his colleagues from the Sanhedrin, versus the minority of his colleagues who divested from him. The Mordechai, that Mordechai, where did he come from? From Yerushalayim. That's how he has the whole backstory with Haman. Savar Lei, he holds like the Yerushalmi, which says what? Kishita se Yerushalmi. That because I am involved in communal affairs, Srara in this case, I'm a leader, I'm a ruler for the sake of the community, that what? I'm investing very little time in learning Torah. But just like the Hasidim Erishenim, the first Hasidim who invested 9 hours into davening and learned only a very little, they had a bracha in their learning, and so not only was it not forgotten what they had already learned, but actually they learned even more based on the amount of time they invested. It was above the amount of time that they invested. So too with me. And because he entered into the rulership or government, because for the sake of saving lives, saving Jewish lives, nitna bracha b'teirasei v'yochel yishar b'sanhedrin. he has a special blessing in his learning of Torah, and he should and can remain in the Sanhedrin, which is all about learning Torah. Am I learning Torah as much as my colleagues? No. But my Torah learning, because of my involvement in communal affairs, has a bracha, which means in the limited amount of time that I am able to put in, much less than my colleagues, I actually have the same results as them. Therefore, I can stay. The minority of the Sanhedrin at that point had actually, the younger ones, had actually come from Babylon at that point. The Jewish people had already been in Babylon for a little bit longer, and so there was a new generation of the younger judges in the Sanhedrin that didn't come from Israel. They had already been born in or educated in Babylon, and so they held like the Babylonian Talmud, which says, yeah, it's very nice that you're not forgetting any of your Torah, but you don't have the time to put in, to learn enough Torah to keep up with the rest of us. And so in that regard, it's not appropriate that you should remain in the Sanhedrin. That the whole idea of, again, the Sanhedrin is just learning Torah, and you're just not holding your weight in that regard, and therefore we're divesting from you. That explains how that can come. Ella, but Shelachaira Dain Kosher, we still have a question. The save calling Yonam Shal Sanhedrin Hu Limud Atera Veira. The final bottom line of the Sanhedrin is only learning Torah and teaching Torah. Rambam, very clear law. The Sanhedrin Shegolu Memekoimam Belishka Sagozis ain't done it in Nefoshes. The Gemara and Rambam says that a Sanhedrin that was exiled from their place in the Beis HaMikdash, right? There was that special room which was half inside, half outside of the actual structure of the Beis HaMikdash. When the Sanhedrin sits there, they have a divine inspiration that allows them to even put somebody to death. But as soon as they're no longer there, even though they're together, even though they're still able to judge other things according to the Gemara, they cannot judge death penalty cases, because they no longer have that inspiration. Why not? They're not in the place from where Torah will emanate. So Sanhedrin is all about Torah. Uladas Ramban, when it comes to the Ramban, he's even more strict, you can call it. Every single adjudication that is dependent on the Sanhedrin is no longer able to be judged. Not just the death penalty cases. For example, the egla rufa, the calf that we break its neck, right? When we discover a body, we don't know who killed it. That the measurement of that involves the Sanhedrin. Ramban says they can't do that either. All sorts of other things that the Sanhedrin would do, which isn't specifically a death penalty case, they cannot do once they are not in their place. Communal affairs is based on the discussion about the general Torah study of one of those original pious people, not judges in the Sanhedrin. Just a guy who is incredibly righteous and pious and invests 9 hours of his day in davening. The Gemara asks, they're Torah learning, Mr. Pious Joe. And so the answer is either his Torah learning, right? Ramban, just because they are not located in the place from which Torah will emanate, they basically have no function at all. And according to the Rambam, the basic reading of the Gemara, they certainly don't have their main function. So if that's the case, as soon as there's any kind of disconnect between Sanhedrin and Torah, done. What does it matter that Mordechai can kind of, short circuit the answer, right? And well, I have a special blessing in my Torah learning. You're not learning Torah all day, every day. That's it. What does it matter that you have the shortcut? Imkain, and if so, Tumua, it's wondrous, it's not understood. Mordechai that Mordechai could take even some amount of time and be involved in communal affairs, even saving lives. And remain in the Sanhedrin, even though, yes, technically, he can accomplish in 1 hour of Torah learning more than anybody else because he has a special bracha. What does it matter? But be'emes, the true answer is Ein betana dvei Eliyahu Rabba. Look in the Tan Dvei Eliyahu Rabba, which says Ha Yolohem l'Sanhedrin gedei lo leilich v'likshir chavolim shal barzel b'masneihem v'chule v'yachazru b'chol yores Yisrael v'yilamdu es Yisrael. The proper job, role of a judge from the Sanhedrin is to his loins with ropes of steel, in other words, to have no compromise in Torah whatsoever, and to persevere, and to go throughout all of the cities of Israel and to teach them Torah. Not only to sit in the area of the Sanhedrin, but to take it out to the masses. Hari lefonenu, now before us, we see like this: the im yois the kishe chavre Sanhedrin mechazrin biyoris Yisrael chaser betekvam v'koicham lodun betur Sanhedrin. This act of going out throughout the whole country takes away from their time that they could be learning or judging Torah. It takes away from the strength that they have even once they get there to learn and to teach Torah. And nevertheless, that is a fundamental component of their role. Mikol mokem adif lahem lachzer beyoris Yisrael liis mimizake arabim liyeshiv b'mekoymam v'lasik b'Torah la'atzmam. It's better, nevertheless, that they do that and bring merit to others than to sit in their place in the Beis HaMikdash even and learn Torah and judge Torah only when people come to them. So, in essence, being involved in communal affairs is part and parcel of being a judge in the Sanhedrin. Is part and parcel of being a Talmid Chacham. So how could Mordechai lose so much time, as it were, in his communal activities? That's part and parcel of who he was, being a judge in the Sanhedrin. So it comes out that the goodness or benefit of the masses actually pushes off the requirement for even and specifically Talmidei Chachamim and judges in the Sanhedrin to actually be involved in Torah. It's similar to the laws, to the halacha on Shabbos, that if, let's say, there is somebody who is in a life and death situation, and in that particular case, we are allowed to and required to violate Shabbos or to push off Shabbos in order to save them, to call the police or, something like this. The Shulchan Aruch says very clearly and explicitly, it should be done by the leaders of the congregation, by the rabbis, and by the Torah scholars, so that people shouldn't think that it's something that isn't quite so right, but for a regular person it's okay. In this regard also, everybody should be involved in communal affairs in one way or the other. But specifically those that you would think should be doing only Torah learning, like judges in the Sanhedrin whose very life is Torah, they specifically should be the ones at the forefront of dealing with communal affairs. V'afilu teikif limudam betur Sanhedrin hanegel harabim. Asher mizem muvan gam binyanenu. Based on all of this, we understand about Mordechai shekedai leile Mordechai liyered memadrigose belimad Torah u'imailes yes teirase umnose. It's appropriate that Mordechai should descend from his previous level of only learning Torah, v'lasek b'tzarchei tzibur v'atzolos Yisrael, in order to be involved in the communal affairs and saving Jewish people. But nevertheless, the fact that he should do that is great. How can he remain a member of the Sanhedrin? Is only because, after all is said and done, his Torah learning is still on par, because he has that special blessing for his Torah learning because of his pious involvement. Because if not, he can learn Torah all he wants, but he can't adjudicate Torah for people. If you're not on par, you can't just say, I want to help somebody, therefore I'm going to tell you what to do according to Torah, but it's wrong. But within the echo chamber that is the Sanhedrin, there were some who didn't, who he lost status in their eyes.